So this is taking big data set that I've started collecting in my PhD and have continued to collect and kind of keep adding to, annoyingly, since then. It kind of becomes irresistible of more and more. So now it's over 1,500 inventors.
Wow.
Of the period, everything there is to know about them, pretty much. Sometimes
it's a multi-volume work at this point.
It's well, hopefully it'll just be one book, but at least as like this is the one I'm working on right now. I will very arrogantly call my magnum opus and say after this one, all the other books will be lesser ones.
Right.
Howdy, welcome back to the Idea to Impact podcast. In today's episode, Jack and I are talking to Anton Howes, who is the head of innovation research at the Entrepreneurs Network. Prior to this, he was a lecturer in economic history at King's College of London, and before that, a postdoctoral researcher at Brown University. He received his PhD in 2016 from King's College in London on the causes of Britain's acceleration of innovation that gave rise to the Industrial Revolution. Anton specializes in the study of invention. His first book, Arts and Minds, tells the story of Britain's subscription-funded National Improvement Agency, the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce. Grab a cup of coffee because you're going to really enjoy this week's episode on the discussion of inventors, inventions, and Anton's quest to discover what caused the acceleration of innovation which led to Britain's Industrial Revolution. Let's get started. Well, howdy, and welcome back for another episode of the Idea to Impact podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Jack Manhire, and I am, of course, Beth Duermeyer. Today, we have a special guest joining us all the way from across the pond in one of my favorite cities over there in London. Anton Howes specializes in the study of invention and more specifically, the causes of the British Industrial Revolution. So in fact, Anton, that is currently the topic of the book that you're writing. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. So the thing I'm trying to explain is why is it that in the past few centuries, we've been getting richer and richer, getting better and better living standards every year. Whereas before that, just before the 17th, 18th centuries, we had pretty much an era of constant stagnation. Maybe there'd be a bit of growth, there'd be a few, what are often called by economic historians, efflorescences, these bubblings up of progress, but often they would kind of then slide away into stagnation again. So the key thing that I'm trying to explain in a lot of my research, and the reason I focus on invention, innovation in particular, is why is it that we've had this hockey stick graph of increases in living standards, sometimes shown by GDP per capita, but that doesn't, I think, even capture the full range of the improvement that's been taking place. So industrial revolution there meaning, in a very broad sense, I think, an acceleration of innovation.
Okay. Yeah, and so this is going to be a really interesting topic, but I want to first dive into, you have your PhD, and this is kind of what your dissertation work was about. So how did you get into that? What made you want to study this?
Well, it started with just a general interest in economic growth. When I started my PhD, which was a few years ago now, more than I'd care to admit, that I was originally going to do a public policy PhD at King's College London, and my supervisor fortunately was especially lax and let me just kind of get on with whatever it is that I want to do. So originally I was just going to be looking at growth theories. What is it that economists were doing? How does that match up with historical record? Because I always had a bit of a historical interest there. And that narrowed down to a particular case study, which was the Industrial Revolution, because it's the first time where there's this acceleration of invention. It seems to be somewhat special with regards to, especially if you're trying to compare with more recent case studies, in that a lot of the time you get countries that are famous for fast growth, like China, recently, like Japan, South Korea, and so on, more slightly earlier. And the difference in their kind of growth is that a lot of the time they're catching up to some other country, they're adopting their technologies. What made Britain special and kind of interesting, 18th century Britain in particular, was that it seems to start suddenly pushing the technological frontier out itself, inventing technologies for itself that are then adopted by other countries. So this case study suddenly turned into more than just a case study, ended up being the subject of the whole work. And now actually the past 10 years or so of what I've been working on. And more specifically, there's a lot of different explanations of the Industrial Revolution. People will talk about culture, they'll talk about geography, they'll talk about institutions. Some people will look at the patent system, or they'll say, there was political stability of some kind, maybe proto-democracy had some kind of role. It's a bit like causes of the fall of the Roman Empire. There's 1,001 different explanations. I often used to say to students that there are, imagine there are 100 explanations of the Industrial Revolution. If you put 100 economic historians into a room and told them to fight it out, they'd come up with 200, and most of them would be mutually exclusive.
Right.
So there are so many different theories all rattling around. And for me, one of the things I noticed was that we talk often about inventors of the Industrial Revolution, and there are certain names that'll stand out to people. In America, I'm sure people, a bit later is someone like Thomas Edison. A bit earlier, you might have someone like Eli Whitney. I think Cormick, or there's a few other American inventors' names. In Britain, you'll think of people like Edmund Cartwright for the power loom, Richard Arkwright, Hargreaves, again, textile machinery pioneers, people like Isambard Kingdom Brunel as a civil engineer. There's this vision of the Industrial Revolution that is very particular to certain technologies and so on. And the thing I noticed was that actually there are hundreds more of these inventors. And to really understand what's going on here, we really need to focus down on these individuals. What is it that the actual people who are doing the inventions, progressing the technology that gave us the Industrial Revolution, what exactly were they doing and thinking and saying, and what was their background and so on? So I started putting together this vast database, which has been the basis of pretty much all my work. Now it's almost 1,500 people active between the mid-16th to the mid-19th centuries in Britain. Not necessarily British-born, a lot of them are immigrants as well, but people active in Britain at that time, to try and work out, what it is exactly that they were doing, and then trying to draw lessons from that.
Wow. And you're looking at each individual doing as much of a deep dive as you possibly can into that person. I mean, that seems like a Herculean task.
Yeah, so I'd start, there's certainly all of the famous ones.
Right.
You'll have your James Watt and your Matthew Bolton and your Brunel and your Hargreaves and Kay and so on, that maybe will ring a bell to listeners. And then there'll be loads more, hundreds even, of people who, in collecting the sample, I would maybe look for mentions in a particular industry. If there's a history of a particular industry, and wanting to make sure I capture as many of the innovators in that industry as possible. And I'll have, a name, maybe even just a surname and a date for the invention, or just the name of the invention, then try to extrapolate back from that. So a lot of archival research, a lot of newspaper archives, obituaries, it turns out, are fantastic for finding these people sometimes.
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that.
Right. Them. Ancestral records, baptismal stuff, funerary stuff, wills, a lot of the time having to really go into some detail. Unfortunately, sadly, for a few hundred of them, I still only have bare bones stuff, tentative birth dates, death dates, a few inventions. But occasionally I'll hit the jackpot, find a really detailed obituary, and then kind of opens up all these other possibilities around them as well.
Now, you talked about just a second ago the time period for the British Industrial Revolution going from the 16th century to the 18th century. And I know for me, and maybe other viewers and listeners, when we were kids in school, we had always thought the Industrial Revolution was this kind of 19th century, in the 1800s phenomenon. And it just kind of popped up, and then there were factories and there were smokestacks, and and people got rich or something like that. You're going back farther than that, and talking about a longer kind of burn. Talk a little bit about that, and why we're going back to the 16th century and not sticking with the way we tend to think about it.
Yeah, so the standard date for the dates for the Industrial Revolution will often be something like, you'll hear 1780 to 1830, maybe 1760
Right.
to 1850. Again, there's a lack of consensus on when exactly it seems to happen. And I think part of that is because a lot of the time when we talk of industrial revolution, we get that, as you say, almost Dickensian view of it. We think of, Oliver Twist and please sir, may I have some more sir, and orphans going up chimneys and factories and soot and coal and steam engines and railways. That's exactly right? That is exactly what people think of. And if I say industrial revolution, you say cotton, you say iron, you say coal, you say steam, you say railways perhaps. And that unfortunately is just a very tiny part of the story. And really, to explain what's going on, we have to look earlier, because very often the causes of those things are much more deeply rooted. So a lot of the inventions that become quite famous, they're actually invented much, much earlier, and then it takes years and years and years and years for them to be adopted more broadly. So actually the steam engine's a great example of this, right? It really starts to have a big impact on the British economy in the 1850s, but it's applied to locomotion around 1800. Before that, it's applied to rotary motion in the 1760s. Before that, it's applied to pumping mines in the 1700s or even the late 1690s. And the scientific principles upon which it's based, which is understanding of the vacuum, is actually starting to emerge in the early 1600s, mid 1600s. So the time frame that we need to look at here, I think, keeps getting drawn back and back. And actually, a lot of the work on measuring economic growth seems to be placing it farther and farther back as well. So there seems to be now a consensus emerging around, and this is very difficult to estimate. Like, frankly, GDP figures for anything pre-1870 is almost like guessing. You have to take them with a rock of salt rather than just a pinch. This is rough stuff, but it gives us a pretty good idea. And it seems like it's actually the mid 17th century that there seems to be a bit of a step change. And I think anecdotally, or in terms of the way that people at the time talked about the country as well, you can see that happening, right? Britain already in 1700, well before the classic Industrial Revolution period, has a reputation as being the place where if you want something improved, you go there, right? If you want, there's a saying, if you want something invented, as in something thought up, invention in a very broad, almost literary sense. Right. If you want to come up with some crazy scheme, go to France. If you want something improved, that is perfected, incrementally optimized, and so on, you go to Britain. Right. So that's already there by 1700. And even before that, like I increasingly call the crucial century 1550s to 1650s. And the reason for that is because if you were an extraterrestrial and you visited the world in, say, 1540, and you were looking for signs of civilization, let's say, you were looking for signs, where's the place that's going to start inventing all the stuff that's going to, send spaceships out and create all of these technologies that we as visiting extraterrestrials already have, you would not choose Britain. There's no way you would choose Britain in the 1540s. This is this dreary island in the North Atlantic. It's cold, it's wet. I mean, it's got pretty good agriculture and so on. It is sparsely populated. London, its main city, is teeny tiny. I mean, we're talking barely 70,000 people. Oh, wow. Probably less, probably around 50 to 70,000 people. I would instead, if we think that urbanization is important, I'd be looking at Chang'an or some other of these mega cities in China. Right. If I was looking for population density, I probably would be looking to the east. If I was looking even within Europe, I'd be looking at the urbanized the Netherlands and modern day Belgium, this kind of area, saying this is where all the riches are. Or I'd be looking at Italy and looking at those cities. On pretty much every metric, Britain or England at the time is unexceptional. And yet, 100 years later, everything is transformed. London is already one of the largest cities on the continent and one of the largest cities in the world. It becomes so definitely by 1800, but it already has this unprecedented growth just from the 1550s through to the 1650s up to 1700. It gets this reputation for improvement, reputation for all of these new industries that are suddenly introduced. I mean, England in 1540s is overwhelmingly agricultural. And it barely has a lot of the industries for which Britain later on becomes famous. Iron was almost not, like, there is some iron making, but it's not on anything near the scale of later. Loads of the metals aren't even being exploited, things like copper, in a way that we would call industrial anyway, right? This is a backwater technologically. And yet it goes from backwater to the forefront. So I like to start it in the place where we can definitely say there is nothing there is no industrial revolution happening here, and then start to look a bit forward, so that by 1700, I think things are really going innovation-wise. And then the results of it are what we like to call the Industrial Revolution. It's kind of a funny thing, really, because nearly every book about the Industrial Revolution that's been written within the past few decades almost always starts in the first few paragraphs with something along the lines of, this is a book about the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is a crap term that we have inherited from, about 100 years ago from historians, and yet it's the one that sticks, so I'm going to keep using it. And then they have to redefine it around it. So it works. It's the one that sticks, right. But unfortunately, it has all of these connotations to it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So I'm an alien, and I'm, thinking that urbanization, population density, all the things that you talked about are going to be the seeds from which this type of growth and acceleration is going to happen, and it isn't there in England at the time. So I'm assuming that population density you found is not necessarily the driver for innovation and acceleration that we all assume it is. First of all, am I right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I suspect that it is an important factor. So I guess the way to explain this would be that one of the main things I noticed from my database is that the overwhelming majority of inventors that I looked at, there was one thing that kept on coming back in my studies. Noticed it first during the PhD, and then actually kind of developed it much further, actually going into the detail for each of them, which is that every factor I could think of that people thought was important, there'd be a few inventors who maybe were affected by that thing. I don't know, patents, not all of them took out patents. Some of them did, but not all of them did. So clearly that's important for some, but not for all of them, right? Something like that. Or, the extent to which they got rich, or, did they all do apprenticeships or so on? There are a lot of things that people say are important for invention. And it was always a kind of partial success when looking at the inventors in the sample. But there was one thing that all of them had in common, it seemed. And I've managed to find this for about 83% of the sample, which is pretty damn high, right? You very rarely find something for that many people from hundreds of years ago before their first known invention. And then maybe there's a bit of an error bar here, right? Because I said first known invention. Maybe there's some early ones I don't know. But before their first known invention, there seems to be some evidence of them having prior contact with another inventor. So before they had ever even thought of becoming inventors themselves, they seem to have met another inventor or been exposed to another inventor in some kind of way. So what this suggested to me is perhaps invention is spreading, almost like a kind of contagion. It's a sort of inappropriate analogy here now, but at the time, I've been using this for years and years.
It's an unfortunate one, but it works.
It's now unfortunate as a connotation. Yeah,
everyone understands it now. So
yeah, exactly. So invention seems to be something that's somewhat viral. And then if you drill down into it deeper, there are a few more interesting things, which is that you might say, okay, well, obviously invention's viral. People learn skills from one another and it passes down. But I don't think invention is a skill. And the reason for that is that a lot of the inventors that people were coming into contact with were not necessarily inventors in the same industry that those people then went on to improve, suggesting there's something else being transferred. There's something that's a bit more amorphous, a bit less definite than a particular kind of way of doing things. And the other interesting thing is the majority of the inventors in my sample, and this is using a very restricted definition of it, but the majority of them seem to be polymathic. That is, they're inventing in multiple industries. They're not just going, you're not just picking up and saying, I'm a textile worker, I'm going to improve looms, or I'm going to improve, particular textile machinery. Now, you might start with that, but then often they're looking at other industries after that. They're getting interested in steam engines or pottery or gardening or whatever else, whatever other kinds of things they can perhaps improve. As I say, that's a majority of them, at least, if not higher. And this is, again, using a very restricted definition of what counts as getting out of your lane, in a sense.
Right.
To give you an example of that, a lot of the time, I would class a medical invention as including dentistry and surgery and medicines, with actual facts. Maybe there's someone who I'm just saying is just medical, but actually they're also being polymathic within that industry. And a lot of the time, a significant minority of them, at least about a third of them, are inventing at least at one point in their careers in an area in which they have had no formal training whatsoever. No apprenticeship, no, and this is even, again, defining it very broadly, where it's not just that they have no apprenticeship in this area, it's that, I looked at what kind of careers did their fathers have? Is this perhaps something they just picked up from them, and found that a significant minority are simply kind of going out there and improving things they know nothing about. Again, suggesting it's not necessarily something based in skill, but there's something else going on here. And so what I looked at here was what I've identified is what I'd like to call an improving mentality. And this is based partly on those facts that I've noticed from the sample, those findings, but also about how it is that inventors themselves were often talking about invention, which is that they often talk about it as being a sort of mindset or mentality, or a kind of way of thinking, often which they cannot even control, right? It's almost a kind of, once they catch the bug, they're unable to stop using it. There even being a few cases where there are inventors who were brought to financial ruin by an early invention. They're telling their friends, sometimes I'll be walking around and I'll think of another one, I'll be like, smack my head, no, stop it, like I'm not gonna get into that, it's brought me such ruin and I'm not gonna try to. And so the improving mentality is, I think, this idea of seeing room for improvement in things, seeing things that most people, or pretty much everyone, sees as being the ordinary way that things are done, that if there are problems, and not even seeing necessarily that there's a problem with that. And the improving mentality is about first seeing that perhaps there is something to solve here, that there is something to optimize, that there is something that you could improve, seeing room for improvement, and then doing something about it. So it's not just people who are sitting about whining and complaining that things could be better. It's people whining and then, or about something, and then actually coming up with the solutions to them as well.
Is it for improvement's sake? Is it improvements for improvement's sake? Because you mentioned it doesn't necessarily need to be that something's wrong with the current way of doing it. They just always see that marginal, uptick of way of doing it, right? So I'm thinking of like Thomas Jefferson, as far as Americans go, right? Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Thomas Paine. Jefferson especially spent a lot of time at Monticello, gardening and meticulously taking notes to try to improve different agricultural things that he was doing on his estate. And it seemed like he wasn't doing it necessarily to make more money. I mean, and these were moneyed and landed individuals. They, as you said, just had the bug. They just had to do it, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time it's that. In fact, I think very rarely do they seem to be people who start out with the aim of making money.
Okay.
That's often a very fortuitous, for some, end result. And some of them certainly are much greedier than others, right? There's the full panoply of people amongst the inventors. Some of them very selfless, some of them very greedy.
Right.
A lot of them, though, never exploiting it commercially. They're just amateur inventors. They just love the process of invention. Whereas others, especially later on in the period when invention becomes more common, they start to see it as a potential career to go into. Someone like Henry Bessemer, for example, who revolutionized steel making in the 1850s. He starts out he kind of makes invention a profession, because by that stage, the institutions around it and the extent to which invention had become common allowed that to happen. So yeah, I guess one way of putting it is that the improving mentality is contrary to if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is to identify something as actually being a bit broke and then fixing it up as well.
Yeah, it's almost like they have like a curiosity to them. I'm thinking like, they see something and either it's not working or they're thinking, well, how else can this be used? Just like a natural like curiosity. I'm thinking about we're naming all these famous inventors, but Jack, I'm thinking about like the Mark Bindens out there, who one of our faculty members who has his own like tinker shop in his garage, and he's just curious,
right?
He just messes around with things and sees, okay, how else can this be used?
And Mark has this, and maybe you found this as well, but even though he didn't start the tinkering on one particular project with a profit motive, he can easily then move from the tinkerer inventor into the entrepreneur, and then try to take it as far as it needs to go before there's some exit. Was that something that a good number of the folks that you're looking at, did they also have that kind of entrepreneurial, maybe the term wasn't around then, right? But were they able to go from tinkerer, improver to the commercial phase too?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the troubles with the period is that a lot of people would now be classed as entrepreneurs anyway, for the simple fact that before the factory, being paid by the hour, wage labor was extremely
Right,
uncommon. Most people were de facto, or they would be today classed as self-employed.
right.
Most textiles, you'd have the merchant who would, it was called the putting out system. You'd have the merchant who would buy up the raw materials. They'd then take it out to the country and find people's homes and drop off the raw material and say, I'm going to be back in a few months' time and I want to pick up some cloth.
Okay.
So in the home, you'd have the child doing the carding. Typically, the wife would do the spinning, and the husband would do the weaving.
Right.
Usually along those sorts of lines, and then they would be paid by how much they actually did, so per their output. Piecework.
Okay.
Now, in some ways, we're sort of returning to that in a lot of industries, right? Think of Uber drivers or
That's correct.
delivery riders and so on. They're paid for the amount they're done, not per the hour. But that, I guess, one way to think about it is that in general, most people were like that, or had jobs along those lines. So in many ways, a lot of the inventors are automatically entrepreneurs because they have those sorts of things. But yes, I mean, very often you do get people who invent something in one line of business and then set up a new business based on the invention, sometimes to sell the inventions themselves. Eventually, you end up with people who become almost serial inventors, where the thing they do is invention. You get a few people like Samuel Bentham, the brother of Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher. Samuel Bentham is almost like a kind of innovation consultant for various governments. He goes off to Russia and starts inventing things. He comes back to Britain, is put in charge of various innovations in the Royal Navy and in the dockyards. So people are carving out these new careers for themselves as innovators. But yes, very often they'll do some kind of commercialization, or you'll have people who would like to continue doing the inventing, and they often find a partner who will take care of the business side of things.
Right.
There are quite a few cases, I think, that I've noticed, certainly anecdotally, where someone seems to be very good at invention, and then unfortunately, when their partner dies, everything goes terrible because they were not the one with the acumen to keep things going in terms of getting the money in.
And Beth, we see that even here at Texas A&M, where the inventor or the idea person, let me put it that way, the researcher that came up with it, they sometimes even think, hey, I can be a CEO. That's easy, right? And then they get a year or so into it, and then they realize they're in way over their head, and they resign themselves to being the chief science officer or something like that, and then getting somebody who can run the business because they realize they can only go so far. But it sounds like it's not a new issue, right? This is hundreds of years old, right? Yeah.
I mean, the classic partnership that I think for most people come to mind is Bolton and Watt. Is that James Watt is the serial inventor. Now, Bolton is himself an inventor, right? Before he met James Watt, he was also tinkering around with things. He already built up a successful business based on a lot of the product and process improvements that he had himself been coming up with. But he recognizes that Watt is the one who's got more of a scientific background. He wasn't formally trained in science, but he hung out at a university and was the instrument maker for a lot of the greatest scientists of the Scottish Enlightenment. And so this is the guy who's really coming forward with stuff like improvements to the steam engine, as well as, Watt is famous for steam engines, but he was also someone who was doing civil engineering. He came up with devices that would be able to sort of come up with copies of the letters automatically that you were writing, and ways of copying sculptures, and improvements to chlorine and bleaching and all sorts of other chemical things as well. So here's the serial inventor, and Bolton is the guy who handles the money side. Partly, I think, because he has a bit of the kind of harder nose for that sort of thing.
Right.
If I recall correctly, he's one of those almost kind of Jane Austen-esque kind of cases where he was meant to marry one sister who had a big dowry, and then she died, so he marries the slightly younger sister who inherits, so that he could make sure he still had the money, which is then used for setting up the famous factory at Soho near Birmingham.
Mhm. Good
Wow.
to know that there's some good stories in, these tales of inventors, and, like, it almost makes for like a really great soap opera sometimes. But I'm curious, and I've been wondering, what are you considering as um contact with another inventor? You said that everyone kind of had exposure or had interacted with another inventor. So how are you classifying interactions? Like, what qualifies?
Yeah, I mean, usually I'm just looking for mentions of that kind of interaction. Sometimes it can be fleeting. Um, well, so here's the interesting thing. What's curious is that most people's interactions with other people are not recorded. And
Hmm.
yet it's striking that I'm able to find for so
Yeah.
many of them some
I'm
kind of
amazed.
contact. Now,
Right.
in some ways, you have to infer it. So it might be that that contact is somewhat indirect. And so you read in a very early work before they were inventing something that they had cited various inventors, they were clearly reading about other inventions. And so maybe there's some sort of indirect contact, and we've just lost the direct thing that may have happened. I suspect face to face throughout history has been much more important than kind of reading about stuff. But I think that more indirect forms are important as well. Um, now, but usually you're going to find astonishingly really ongoing relationships with people. So John Rennie, famous as one of the great civil engineers of the late 18th, early 19th centuries, he is just a Scottish lad in a rural area, sort of near Edinburgh, but still pretty rural. And the main contact he seems to have with inventors. Now, there's actually a few, but the main one he seems to have is that one of the great millwrights and the guy who's improving water mills and windmills and so on for the whole area for the past almost half a century, Andrew Michael, happens to have retired to the same village that he's in. And so we have all these stories of young Rennie going and hanging out with old Michael, who's the kind of grandfatherly figure who lets him into the workshop, shows him around, and kind of he gets him engrossed in invention along those ways. Or another great one, Charles Babbage will be a name that's familiar to a lot
Right.
of people,
Sure.
especially through
Yeah.
computing. Now, this is a really fascinating one. You sometimes hear this as it almost sounds like it must be apocryphal, some kind of myth, that he very young in life, and he mentions this in his autobiography, even his memoirs, which is one of the other sources I've tried to use as much as, again, it just gives you so much extra detail than just an obituary or various other sources, even if it's colored by the ravages of time by the time they're writing it, right? So Babbage recounts how when he's very young, he visits the kind of exhibition of automata in London, run by a guy who remembers being called Merlin. And this is actually the guy's name. It's a Belgian immigrant called John Joseph Merlin, who had been responsible for all sorts of inventions, not just tinkering around with automata, but he's apparently the guy who introduces the rotisserie oven to England,
Oh,
who starts bringing over ice skates and coming over, all sorts of other innovations that he's very into. And Babbage recounts how he showed such an interest that Merlin, and he's with his mum, so Merlin takes him up with his mum up to the kind of the hidden room to see the stuff that is still being worked on. And he mentions particular automata, and this was a really fun one for me because I was looking through Merlin's life, and the specific automata that Babbage describes as having been unfinished were sold in an auction after Merlin's death, and the descriptions of them are almost exactly the same.
Wow.
And so there's always this kind of outside proof of the
right.
story, because he's identified it down to the details of what these automata looked like, and the fact that they were unfinished and the state that they are in, and so on. So that seems to be one of those cases, and the fact that some elderly Babbage, when he's setting down his memoirs, remembers this particular instance, and it
Right.
was so firmly lodged in his mind, I think gives you a bit of evidence that there is something inspirational going on there, right? You don't remember that sort of stuff from your childhood unless it has some kind of impact.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, more often, I suspect that people don't remember when they're inspired to things, but it's striking when you do get that evidence, because it stands out so firmly for me as a historian looking for this kind of stuff. So yeah, very often that's almost a fleeting one. But then there are other contacts as well throughout his career. So at university, he meets the son of quite a famous astronomical pioneer, and there's all sorts of other contacts that build up over time. So the thing is, with this contact, often you've got multiple vectors, if you like, of the virus of invention having spread to them. But occasionally you'll really strike gold with a very early one that seems to really stand out.
So when you say connections, the first thing I thought of, perhaps it's too much of a modern understanding of it, is a network. Everybody says, your network is your powerhouse. It's the reason for your success. Network, which to me means I have connections that I can call upon, or that I can refer other people in my network to, and there's different nodes that things go back and forth. Were the connections that you're talking about for these inventors that type of network, or was it simply just kind of bumping into people and being exposed to them at certain times in their lives and then moving on, and not necessarily having these reciprocal relationships back and forth?
Yeah, so a lot of what I'm looking at here is exposure. Now, if I were to do networks, and I wasn't trying to restrict it just to when they were inventors, right? Just
Sure.
the key constraint that I've got when I'm looking at these things, because I'm trying to look at what's happening before they're becoming inventors, for there to be the causality there. If I was to look at networks, it would be much more complicated, right? And most of these inventors end up knowing almost everyone else who's within also inventing. I mean, it becomes a shockingly small world. So I've created maps, based on where are they born versus where it's the site of their first invention. And what's amazing is just how concentrated, where they're born is dispersed all over the place, but where they end up inventing, often for the first time, is London. It's the largest city. It becomes the largest city in the world, as I said. It's the place where people seem to go at one point in their lives, and then they bump into all these other people. Even then, though, strikingly, there's about the 17% that I couldn't find evidence of there being prior connections. Now, those are the 17% about whom, frankly, we actually know almost nothing at all about them anyway.
Right.
And so finding evidence of this kind of very personal thing becomes all the less likely anyway. But for actually a lot of those, when they happen to be in particular towns or cities or villages, what's very striking is that those towns will suddenly ring a bell to me, and I look it up, and it'll turn out that this place in rural Somerset happens to also have a bunch of other inventors there at exactly the same time. And so the chances are that there's the vector going on. I can't prove it, but I can probably infer it to a certain degree from what's going from.
Because you don't have an absence of you have an absence of information, not evidence that there were no connections, right? You just
right. So the fact that there's no evidence isn't confirmation that there was no contact.
Right, exactly.
I think that, and this is the other interesting thing, is there's been a few other studies very recently since doing this. So there was one by a guy called economist called Raj Chetty and a whole team of people who were looking at American inventors in the modern day. And they have unprecedented access to patent records and I think US Treasury records that they were kind of given an anonymized form, but in a way where they could start looking into this sort of stuff. And they found almost exactly the same thing, that even today, it's amazing the degree to which there's co-location of inventors today, often even in the same fields. Well, now, what I would say is that given invention, I think that isn't just a skill, you should expect there to be a lot of co-location that's crossing fields or crossing industries as well.
Right.
So they're finding, there are places in America where that happens to be where you go to school, or even where your school run is, from home to school. You having lived there makes you much more likely to become an inventor. So I've taken this as sort of outside confirmation of my thesis here, in terms of the importance of that kind of connection. Now, as I said, though, if you were to look at connections, as in reciprocal, your social network, it would become even more complicated. But even then, the exposure takes lots of different forms. You could have more formal master-apprenticeship relationships, employer-employee relationships, not necessarily going, downwards. It can be that masters get encouraged by their apprentices, or employers get inspired by their employees, innovative employees. Very often, though, you've also got dynasties of inventors. The fact, and I don't think it's because it's a hereditary gene. I think it's because if you grow up around inventors and you grow up at the knees of inventors, then you're more likely to become an inventor yourself. And And so often, you've got uncles, and there's even I think at least one case where a son inspires his father to become an inventor as well.
Thanks for joining us this week. Join us next week for part 2 of our discussion with Anton, where we kind of dive more into what his work says about policy, how that influences inventors, and how the work he is doing now might influence future policy. See you next week.